Hello and welcome to section 6, the airplanes. Note the symbolic motif that reoccurs throughout the whole novel but is actually the title of this whole chapter. The airplanes as a symbol of hope and civilization. Also, notice how they're used in the chapter, the next section 7, the terminal. And in this chapter, this section, it's a short section. It fluctuates between year 20, then jumps back, and most of it is actually Arthur, Clarke, and Miranda, just pre-pandemic. Anyway, so from 38, we've got 20 years post-pandemic. Kirsten and August are leaving this non-ransacked house. They're carrying their new suitcases through the trees to the road, and they look back and they just reflect on all of the good things they managed to get out of this non-ransacked house they describe as incredible. And Kirsten thinks about what it would have been like to live in a house. You would leave, lock the door behind you, and then all day you would carry a key. And she reflects that Deirdre and Sayid probably have the memory of this life from before, like what it was like to live in houses and carry keys. So this theme of memory coming up again there, and the different life and the struggle of adapting to life post-pandemic there. And there's a big section here where August talks about where the narrator talks about multiple universes, and August believes in multiple universes, where there's like parallel universes that exist, and depending on one little change, it might cause a complete different possibility. And so that kind of is explored, that there is this infinite number of parallel universes that, depending on what happens and the choices in your life, there's maybe one universe where there's no pandemic and August has become a physicist, or one where there's been a pandemic but the virus has like a subtly different genetic structure, which means that it's survivable, and it's kind of like this possibility of the random things, chance that determines all things. It made me think of a movie that I saw when I was probably your age called Sliding Doors. If you want to Google that one, Sliding Doors, it's actually a love story between a couple, and Gwyneth Paltrow either catches the train or misses the train, and what actually happens in her life depending on this one moment in time. Anyway, so Miranda and August have collected a bunch of magazines from this unransacked house, and in one of them there is an image of Arthur's third wife, and in another one there's an image of Miranda, his first wife. And that image is actually from just 2 weeks before the end of the world, and Kirsten's like, I think I was there. Might have been in that building. Like, she's got this vague memory. An impression of a colouring book and pencils, Arthur's voice. She just couldn't be sure. She can't hold on to it. She doesn't remember Miranda, but she sort of has this vague memory. It's 2 weeks before the apocalypse. And then coming back to that idea of parallel universes, well, she also sometimes looks at these collection of pictures that she's got and imagines herself in this other life, in this other shadow life where you could just flip a switch and there's a light that comes on and a garbage truck comes around and collects your garbage, and all of the things that emphasize that convenience of the modern life. And then August discusses the possibility of a parallel universe where space travel was invented, and just like the comic books, well, Arthur thinks the comic books are weird. He's thinking more like Star Trek. And it's interesting because Kirsten down the bottom here talks about the fact that the comic books and Station 11 is beautiful. She really would love to have a parallel universe where her comics are real. a parallel universe where she boarded Station 11 and escaped before the end of the world. This desire for escapism, and she sees beauty in the Station 11 and the comics. And even though it's always night or twilight, even though that perhaps maybe this is symbolizing the fact that even though there is a pandemic on Earth, there is still beauty on Earth. Or even though Station 11 is always night or twilight, there is still beauty in in Station 11. Arthur decides he wouldn't want to go to Station 11 because they don't have an orchestra or a violin for giant seahorses. And they're escapism a bit. They're nearly at the airport here. And they about to take watch. I noticed the bottom here says there is slow rise of fireflies from the grass, and they listen to the water on the beach across the road, a sighing of wind in the leaves, and the metaphor of the light there, but also here these sounds of nature, representing the fact that nature survives even though most of the people on Earth haven't. The power of nature as a force, a survival force. And then August and Kirsten discuss the scar, the guy they met, Finn, the scar on his face, and that it looks like an aeroplane. And of course, that's foreshadowing danger or like whatever's to come at Severn Airport. 39 is back 2 weeks before the end of the world. And this is the scene where Miranda visits Arthur. Arthur got in contact with Miranda saying that his dad had died, and Miranda visits. And visiting Toronto, she observes the CN Tower, which is this image here. And she's in a plane, okay? Aeroplanes. Being the title of this section. She arrives, and as she arrives in Toronto, she faces these ghosts of herself everywhere. She sees a 23-year-old Miranda in the wrong clothes and a 27-year-old Miranda who's recently divorced, and you know, as she's seeing these previous versions of herself, she feels that they're so distant now that she's almost like thinking of another person, remembering another person. And she looks in the mirror and repeats that motif or that mantra that she says to herself, which is, I regret nothing. Almost like she's trying to believe it herself or convince herself. And this is a bit of a flashback section here where she remembers Arthur calling her, telling her that father has died. Arthur remembers his dad and thinks that his life must have been unfathomable to his father. There's the idea of the reason why Arthur is contacting Miranda. They have a shared heritage and connection because of the Delano Island. And Arthur remembers that. He says that you were the one I wanted to call. But Miranda reflects that, well, actually, apart from all of that, he's currently wifeless. A bit cynical, almost like Arthur doesn't know how to be without a wife. He needs somebody, so he was reaching out to her. And during this time, 2 weeks pre-pandemic, Arthur is starring in King Lear. He's in the middle of divorce proceedings with Lydia. And so they meet. Miranda gets ready to go out to meet, and even though paparazzi are not really interested in her now, she's not married to Arthur, she does slick her hair back into a shiny helmet, and trying to be different to her old self, because her old self, she would have a massive curls, but she is putting on an armor. She's wearing expensive shoes and dressed in her favorite suit. She's trying to look strong and tough. She looked like an executive, she says to herself, and it's setting out in early twilight. And she sees this girl in Starbucks with brilliant green hair. And she's like, your hair is beautiful. And then why doesn't anyone at Station 11 have green hair? And I kind of observed that creative process, how people get ideas for their creations here. You see something in real life and the interconnectedness between real life and art, and how both influence each other. That's something I noticed here. Miranda, even though it's twilight, is wearing sunglasses, and that's why she's recognized, because it was a tactical error. From the voice of Miranda, she describes the paparazzo as an effing parasite, which you might see. And then she visits Arthur in his dressing room at the theatre. She remarks that he isn't aging very well. He's got disappointment on his face and a strained quality. He doesn't remember how long it's been, and she's remarks on how that it was a significant event for her. Doesn't everybody remember the date of their divorce the same way they remember the date of their wedding? But hey, Arthur's had 3 weddings and 3 divorces, so maybe that's why. Anyway, they talk about Shakespeare. Arthur has changed the way he speaks. She reflects that he's adopted new speech patterns. He's got 11 years of new friends and acquaintances and meetings and parties and all of these things that have shaped his identity. And he's a completely different person now. Arthur tells Miranda that there's this book coming out, Dear V, and she's in it. He says, I never said anything unpleasant about you. I'm the soul of discretion. She's a bit skeptical. What? Did you say you're famous for your discretion? And so they discuss this book. Arthur says he treated Victoria like a diary. She used to write in the beginning, like 2 or 3 postcards right at the start. And Miranda is shocked, saying, all those times I saw you writing to her, she never wrote back. And Arthur says, yeah, he used her as a repository of his thoughts. And almost forgot she was actually real. From Miranda's narration, we see, does this happen to all actors? This blurring of the borders between performance and life. This man playing the part of the aging actor, sipped his tea. So he's playing the part of an aging actor. So Miranda also reflects that Arthur is playing a part, and I thought you could make connections or compare with Elizabeth's comments about him similarly when she last saw him playing a part, acting, rambling, deflecting, obfuscating, and we can see from a number of different people their same views on Arthur. They continue to talk about children, Tyler, who's just turned 8, and Kirsten enters, she's 7 or 8 years old. She's got a colouring book just like the memory. She's very blonde, incandescent, so she's full of life. And Miranda's like shocked that there can't be a part in King Lear for a 7 or 8 year old. What? The artistic choice in King Lear, having the 3 daughters of King Lear played by child actors, where they're not actually meant to be children in the original Shakespearean interpretation. Miranda comments that the girl looked like a china doll, someone who'd been well cared for and coddled, but she's going to grow up unadventurous and well-groomed, which is kind of ironic because actually Kirsten grows up to be the opposite, badly groomed because of the pandemic and quite adventurous. But I also noticed this irony because I actually think Miranda grows up to be unadventurous and well-groomed in a way. She becomes like a shipping executive, but involved in just the business world, and perhaps lacks the uniqueness that you might have imagined she might turn into, given that she's the creator of the Station 11 comics. But that's just my own opinion. Miranda can see how much he misses his own child, his distant son. He misses Tyler. Kirsten is drawing and she's colouring in book. Arthur asked Miranda, is she still drawing? And yes, she's been still drawing the Dr. 11 comic books, Station 11 comic books, almost like she lives her life through them. Miranda gives Arthur 2 copies of the Station 11 book, and we know that they go to Tyler and Kirsten. So these are the 2 copies that are given. Arthur describes them as beautiful, and the image like an establishing shot from a movie. the significance of this quote we've talked about before. I stood looking over my damaged home and tried to forget the sweetness of life on earth. The theme of survival reinforced there. Kirsten asks about them, and it's just some books my friend Miranda made, says Arthur. Kirsten is questioned what sort of movies has she been in. She's a child actor. Miranda doesn't particularly like child actors. She went in an aeroplane, again, the name of this section, but also the memory that Kirsten had, this vague memory she had of being in an aeroplane. She's drawing. Kirsten is drawing, and she's put stripes on the dress. Miranda thinks that the dress is beautiful. Arthur agrees with her. There's blank outlines of a knight, a dragon, and a tree. And Kirsten says that it isn't perfect. She's not going to finish the princess. And I think perhaps we could consider this criticism by Mandel, or at least acknowledgement how people throw things away that aren't perfect in this modern world. Kirsten is described as an unhappy kid by Arthur. And Miranda says she's going back to Asia. We know that she ends up in Malaysia. She leaves, she goes back to her hotel and remembers the paperweight. She's forgotten to give it to him. So she writes a note and sends it off in the courier to give it back to him. Maybe think about why she would have done that at that point. Anyway, chapter 40. This is Miranda. It's 2 weeks later, right as the old world ended. She's on the beach and she's looking out over the lights of the container ship. Again, transport, the hope of the modern world. It's right as the Georgia flu is closing in. There's some airports that have already closed. Miranda hasn't really been following the news, so she doesn't know too much about the pandemic. She gets a phone call from Clarke telling her that Arthur died of a heart attack last night. Remember, this is all in section 1. All of what we see unfold then. And now we flip to Clarke's side when he's called Miranda. He's going to lift up his phone to call Elizabeth, but he decides not to. He gets a call from Arthur Leander's lawyer again, who's a guy called Heller. And Clarke is kind of reflecting about the ex-wives and the importance of connection or interconnections here in the quote you'll see here, that even after divorce, something must linger, a half-life of marriage, some memory of love, even if obviously not the love or the thing itself. Heller is presented by Mandel as really demanding, even in the middle of this pandemic. Clarke sees him as sort of a bat, as you can see here. There's a quote. And Clarke is remembering his friendship with Arthur from the early days throughout. We are on page 220 at the bottom here, when Heller has actually woken up, although it's the middle of the night, he's called Arthur's brother, who he says is the only family. Arthur says, "What, you didn't call Elizabeth? She is the mother of Arthur's only child." Oh, of course. And on page 221, Clarke reimagines Heller as now not from a bat to a sad, pale, caffeine-addicted man with chronic insomnia. Possibly criticizing, so Mandel's criticism of people who live only to work in thankless jobs, perhaps. You see a lack of joy in the way that he is presented. They talk about Tanya, this person Tanya, who was the babysitter, and that maybe it suggests, well, they were having an affair. Maybe Arthur was going to change his will, which is here on page 222. He said, "Oh, I'm planning on changing my will." So Hella's thinking about this. All kind of pointless, given it's now the end of the world and everyone's going to die. But anyway, there's a memory that Clarke has here, though. You should have seen him when he was younger, when he was starting out, before all of the tabloids and the movies and the divorces, between all of those warping things. We see that these world that Arthur got caught up in, the world of entertainment, the world of desire for fame and success, has actually warped him, which I think is one of Mandel's key views and values here. But Clarke says he was wonderful back then, back at the beginning. I was so struck by him, not romantically, nothing like that, but sometimes you just meet someone. He was so kind to everyone he met. He had this humility about him. We almost don't recognize the way that Clarke is presenting Arthur here. But my comment I made is that Arthur is remembered fondly by Clarke. Clearly, Arthur is not all bad. Clearly, the way that his life has panned out, the influences, external influences, have actually corrupted him. But he's not all bad. And I think that's important for us to recognize too. And Clarke remembers Arthur some more. He thinks about his youth in Delano Island and the way that Arthur spoke about it, and how Arthur just wanted to escape because he was so claustrophobic. And the irony that I see is that Arthur leaves Delano Island because of being claustrophobic, but later develops a life surrounded by the media and the press and the adoration of fans, and he lives a life in the outside world where he is also claustrophobic. So he kind of becomes what he most fears. He says, Toronto was the only place I felt free. And then Clarke gets up the next day, takes a taxi, goes to the airport, and he manages, by some choreography of luck, to avoid passing too close to anyone who was already infected. Notice that phrase there, choreography of luck. Yeah? Which is really reinforcing that idea that it is not a design of a almighty creator as a punishment from God, but is a choreography of luck. It's chance. So Clarke travels to Toronto. He happens to be on the same plane as Elizabeth Colton and her son. Coincidence, but not an enormous coincidence, because they're both flying in for Arthur's funeral, I guess, but they get diverted into Severn City Airport, and we start to see how the paths of all the characters are now going to come back into connection and alignment. And finally, chapter 41 in this section is Miranda's death scene. So she's, after Clarke delivers the note of Arthur's death, she stays on the beach for some time. She goes back to her hotel. She gets the beginnings of a sore throat. Is going to call back Clarke to ask about funeral arrangements. When she gets back to her hotel, she noticed that it's really empty. Somebody's wearing a surgical mask, the imagery of the pandemic. We know as a reader that because she's got the beginnings of a sore throat, it's actually the Georgia flu. It's foreshadowing her death here. She's trying to make phone calls, but every airport's closed. The world is already ending. And back aeroplanes. What you want to spend 12 hours breathing recirculated air with 200 other people. And this makes me think of, in the next section, where we see the airport and the plane that arrives that is quarantined that everybody dies on. She definitely has a sore throat. She's trying to talk herself out of it, but she wakes at 4 o'clock the next morning with a fever. She takes 3 aspirins, but she's got knots of pain in her joints. She reads the latest news and she actually understands what has happened to the world. She understands that she's dying. And she rests her face on the side of the desk here. And she thinks that the room is full of poverty, the poverty of the room. Poverty not in the economic sense, but in the sense of not being enough for the gravity of this moment. It's an insufficient setting for what? Like, she can't think of it. It is an insufficient setting, obviously, for her death. Like, it needs some sort of grand location. And so she thinks of the beach. She thinks she's going to be stranded if she gets any sicker. So she actually forces herself to put on her shoes and she walks down the corridor. She has to walk very slowly because she's very sick. She got her hand on the wall and she sees a man who's curled on his side near the elevators, and he's shivering. She's wanting to speak to him, but it would take too much strength. We see this yearning for connection even in the moment of her death, and she looks at him instead and she says, I see you, inside her head, and she hopes this is enough. The lobby is empty now, and she feels this terrible weakness. She goes to the beach. She's walking very slowly. There's palm trees on either side. The beach is empty, and she collapses onto a lounge on the beach. She's exhausted. It's desperately hot, but she's racked with chills. And she looks and thinks of this container ship on the horizon. She's grateful and she's pleased with the survival of humanity by thinking, well, people out there won't have been exposed to the flu. So she's smiling at herself, to the self, at the thought there are people in the world who are safe. And her last view is, what she last sees is the sunrise, brilliant orange, beauty. For her last moment, well, beauty. And her last thoughts are of Station 11, the extravagant sunsets and its indigo sea, and the lights of the fleet fading into the morning, the ocean burning into sky. And that is the end of section 6.